Miles McCarthy's mom had been missing for 2 years when he received a call from a Florida hiker who had discovered strange lumps on a tree in the forest. He had a gut feeling that compelled him to deeper. As he closed in on the location, it dawned on him that the lumps were a hint that could solve the long-standing problem of his mom's disappearance. Miles knew that he had to seize this opportunity. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't. And hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The past month had been rough for 20-year-old Miles McCarthy. Like most people his age, he was still trying to find his place in the world. After 2 traumatic years filled with night terrors and regular therapy appointments, at long last he had reached the point of a fresh start. But then, his phone started ringing on that momentous night. As a child, Miles had always been rather quiet. He was an only child growing up in a loving family. His parents ensured he had everything he could ever dream of. He had been granted every book and toy he'd wanted, every wish to visit a theme park that most kids only dreamed of. But above and beyond all the material spoils of his childhood, Miles had 2 attentive parents who loved him unconditionally. He could never have imagined the horror that his future held. One of Miles's favorite things was his life in Florida. He was in love with the beaches and woods, the sunny mornings, and the evening rainstorms. He had a great time in high school, being one of the top students in his class, both in academics and sports. He had the absolute perfect life, oblivious to the looming tragedy coming for him. When Miles was 18, disaster struck and his world crumbled. His mom and best friend, an acclaimed botanist, suffered a sudden heart attack. Miles and his dad drove her to the emergency room in a panic, praying she'd survive. Several hours later, the doctor emerged to tell them his conclusions. Miles's mom was diagnosed with diabetes, and her abnormally high blood pressure triggered the cardiac arrest. The doctor reassured them that she would quickly bounce back, but he was unaware that her recovery would eventually result in her disappearance. Miles vividly recalled how everything about his life suddenly changed. His mom had always been a bright and happy person, but she had suddenly become a completely different person. She shut herself in her room for endless hours, only emerging to eat, to use the bathroom, or to wish him goodnight. Yet Miles's nightmares were only just beginning. Miles's dad did his utmost to bring her old self back to the surface. However, it appeared that her diagnosis had turned her into someone entirely new. Meanwhile, his dad invested his whole being into his mom's circumstances, abandoning Miles to look after himself, even though he was just a teenager. Before long, he was feeling completely alone, even in a busy home. Miles believed that their family could get through this difficult time. Just like any family, they'd had their fair share of issues, but no past struggle had divided them like this before. Then, out of the blue, his dad reported that his mom had vanished. Miles could perfectly recall the phone call that night, his dad frantically telling him that she'd been missing for 3 days. But it wasn't yet time for the devastating conclusion. They then began a search that would carry on for 2 years, but eventually led nowhere. Every passing month was more agonizing for Miles. He just couldn't comprehend why someone would hurt a woman who was already suffering. The police reported that his mom was last sighted riding her bike into the nearby woods, one of her favorite pastimes. They vowed to put all their efforts into her case, but their promises wouldn't hold up long. The local police couldn't make any meaningful progress on Miles's mom's case. They lost any signs of her somewhere in the dense, winding woods. Multiple search parties were formed, complete with helicopters and K-9 squads. The authorities even called for help from civilian volunteers. The search, however, would prove fruitless. It reached a point where law enforcement had to declare that the case had gone cold. No one was able to explain how a middle-aged mom could get lost in a section of the woods she was intimately familiar with. No part of her disappearance made sense. The police encouraged Miles and his father to find a way to carry on their lives as normally as possible, vowing that the case would be reopened if any clues were found. 2 years later, there were still no developments. Miles and his father moved to a different state, hoping for a new start. Even though it made their hearts ache, they sold their house and tried to move forward. Miles frequently went for therapy sessions to help him handle it all. After some time, he was eventually able to get his life back on track. But 2 years into college, he got a phone call that would turn his world upside down once more. On the other side of the phone was a hiker called Tim, a 24-year-old who regularly visited the area in the woods where Miles's mom had disappeared. After Tim's own mother had gone missing in the exact same woods 5 years ago, he couldn't bear to think there was another teen experiencing the same thing. Miles couldn't have guessed what the hiker would reveal to him. The story Tim told Miles initially sounded very strange. While he'd been hiking through the trees, Tim had found a tree that wasn't quite as normal as he first thought. He had ventured further into the woods than ever before and wasn't expecting to find something like this in the area he was in. When he examined the tree up close, it became obvious that it was a clue to where Miles's mom had vanished to. Tim had scrutinized the tree from close up, inhaling sharply when his theory was confirmed. He snapped several photos and hurried back home, eager to crack Miles's mom's case open. Before doing anything else, he hurried to the police station to report what he'd found. But the authorities weren't very interested in his evidence. They couldn't imagine that a species of tree would be the clue that opened up a case that had been firmly shut for over 2 years. Realizing that he'd need more urgent assistance with the situation, Tim headed to the McCarthys' old house. He was aware they'd moved away, but he was hoping to find out where to. Luckily, a neighbor could get him in touch. Their ex-next-door neighbor, a lovely elderly lady, informed Tim that Miles and his dad had moved further north. She wasn't sure exactly where, but she guessed New York or maybe Pennsylvania. Tim felt dejected. Tim had mistakenly thought that the McCarthys had only moved to a different town or county, so when he discovered they'd crossed state lines, his hope began to run out. He returned to his own home to reconsider the situation. If his hunch was correct, the tree would be the key to solving the whole case. The next step would involve a lot of time and effort. Would it be worthwhile? Tim desperately wanted to protect Miles from the pain he himself had experienced. He was optimistic that he could provide the possibility of a happier future based on the closure he might be able to find within the trees. The hiker's forest discovery was truly astounding. The species of tree he'd come across wasn't native to the region, implying someone had planted it there deliberately. Tim believed there was a chance it could have been Miles's mom or even just someone who could help them find her. Tim turned to the world of social media, tracking down every Miles McCarthy he could find. He hadn't met Miles personally, but he'd contacted local teenagers who knew him, cross-referencing the photos they shared with him to find a match. After some intense searching, he found Miles on Facebook. He deliberated for several hours before deciding to message the 20-year-old. Tim couldn't sit still while he waited for Miles to read his message. He knew his actions were risky. It wasn't always helpful to reopen old wounds, but he'd already crossed the line, and he'd resolved to do his best to save Miles from the same fate he'd suffered. He couldn't breathe as he watched Miles opening the message, but he got no reply. Despair was building up inside him, so he made a decision to do something drastic. Tim clicked on the call icon in Facebook Messenger, and Miles answered. Before Tim could say anything, the younger man started confronting him for mocking his problems. He revealed that every month, a variety of people would send him distasteful messages making fun of his mom's case. Tim quickly promised him that his message was different. Moreover, he'd stumbled across a clue that might be able to revive the dormant case. Adrenaline flooded Miles's veins. The deep-seated resentment he'd battled against in therapy quickly rose back to the surface. It was a cocktail of dread, anguish, anxiety, hopelessness, and crushing desperation for the mystery to be solved. Miles didn't have to stop and think when Tim asked if he could get on a plane to Florida to delve deeper into the woods with him. Camping and hiking equipment on their backs, the two young men trekked the waterlogged forest path for endless hours, accompanied by the relentless Florida rain. No search had ever driven Miles so intensely before. He hadn't even revealed the truth behind his Florida visit to his dad. He had just claimed that he wanted to see some old friends he hadn't seen in the 2 years since they'd moved away. His deceit would soon lead to serious consequences. Miles and Tim trudged through the dense trees, following the uneven terrain as it went up and down. Miles told the story of the police's intense search of this same area many months ago. He was curious about Tim's certainty that one single tree was going to give him the answers he sought. Tim just smiled. "You'll understand when you see it," he said. Miles trusted the hiker's confidence and his thorough knowledge of the area, but he had no idea what they'd find at the end of the forest path. The trail dropped steadily down a steep slope. Miles and Tim followed it into the forest valley, a lush green expanse that seemed to go on forever. The sun was hanging low, a deep orange sky peeking out behind the receding rain clouds. While they hiked on, Tim shared his own story of his mom disappearing into the woods, making it obvious that he knew exactly what Miles was dealing with. But had he ever found his mom? Smiling somberly, he told Miles of the 5-year ordeal before the police finally closed his mom's case. They had found her body among the wild plant life. Most tragic of all was the fact that her body was only about 6 months old, while she had been missing for 5 years. Law enforcement hypothesized that she likely managed to keep herself alive for 4.5 years, trying to find her way home, but died due to a lack of food or water or at the hands of nature. But just like the case of Miles's mom, none of the events seemed logical. Hearing what had happened to Tim made Miles understand that he wasn't alone in what he'd gone through. But the story had also horrified him. Tim's mother had never managed to get home. With his own experience, Miles knew how devastating that was. He brushed away his tears and sped up. He was desperate to put his mind at ease, and the only route he had to do so was to see the strange tree Tim wanted to show him. The somber duo plowed through the endless foliage into the center of the forest basin. The sun had dipped below the horizon at this point, and they had to pull out their flashlights to be able to navigate the rough trails. Tim proposed that they look for higher ground to set up camp for the night, but Miles's nervous energy and desperation to find answers meant he couldn't stop moving. He knew he was on the precipice of discovering the truth. "We have to keep going," he urged, continuing down the trail even though Tim cautioned him against hiking in the dark. "The woods aren't safe at night," he insisted, but Miles wouldn't listen. Realizing he wasn't going to convince the younger man, Tim carried on the search. It wasn't long before they reached a forest clearing. With a hand on Miles's shoulder, Tim halted him. "We're here," Tim said and flashed his light at the center of the clearing. Before them, there gleamed the wet leaves of the tree in question. It was younger than the growth around, tamer. One look at it, and Miles knew precisely what Tim had meant by "you'll see for yourself." He ate back a cry, his stomach heating. Only one thing could explain what he was looking at. "This tree isn't indigenous to this place," Miles croaked, and Tim exclaimed the idea aloud. "Yes." He stepped closer and added, "Someone planted it, and recently too." He pointed around the circular clearing. "All of this? Someone cleared all of this?" "It must have been my mom," Miles wanted to say, remembering his mother was a botanist with an undying love for plant life. But his words turned to ice on his tongue when a figure materialized from the darkness. "Mom," he stammered. The woman emerged from the forest darkness, locking eyes with Miles. Her hair was a matted mess in loose braids and her clothes were a bit dated, but she wasn't covered in dirt or scratches. She seemed in control in a situation where many would have lost their minds a long while ago. "Miles," she called, and Miles' heart almost burst in his chest. He tore forward, hugging the woman tightly. It was his mom, and he couldn't believe he'd found her. But when another door closes, another opens. Finding his mom alive could only mean one of two things. She'd either run away from home, not wanting anything to do with Miles and his dad, or had truly been lost and couldn't find a way home. Miles knew he needed to get to the root of the matter. But after 2 years without his mom, he figured he could let the questions rest for a night. He felt alive now that he'd found his mom. All those months of pure torture could burn in hell now. He had no idea that his world was about to turn upside down. "It's dangerous out here," Miles' mom said, beckoning Tim closer. "I saw your flashlights and thought you were lost hikers. People rarely come this deep into the forest for a good reason. It's easy to lose your way, fall into some pit, or worse, end up at some animal's dinner." Tim swallowed a lump of air, making the woman chuckle. "But it's okay now." "We're safe." Taking Miles's hand, she asked if they wanted to go to her place. Miles and Tim followed Mrs. McCarthy through the dark, twisted trees. The ground was still covered in mud. The sound of swaying trees, bird and cricket chirps, and frog croaks blanketed the whole area. The woman led them to another clearing. It was well lit, with a log cabin in its middle. The place seemed cozy enough, with a garden toward one side and a hide rack on the other. But that wasn't all. There was a bench beside the garden, seemingly for studying, a fireplace that Miles's mom had covered with black plastic paper, and a single lantern lighting the whole place. This place didn't look like a shelter for someone trying to survive after getting lost in a forest. It was the home of someone trying to keep a low profile. "Shoes," Mrs. McCarthy pointed before motioning Miles into the cabin. He didn't know what he'd expected to find, but his mouth fell open. The interior was warm and welcoming. A thick rag carpeted the floor, 2 chairs and a table marked the dining area, an entire couch, a fireplace, and a coffee table marked the living room. And a kitchen stood in the farthest corner of the cabin. 2 rooms were hidden behind 2 separate doors. "Welcome home," Miles's mom said, walking to the kitchen. All this should have answered the questions racing in Miles's head, but they only added more mystery to an already weird situation. "Nice place," Mommy said, fighting the urge to follow her into the kitchen as he usually did when younger. "Thank you," his mom replied from across the cabin. "It belonged to a friend of mine." "Do you like it?" "I do. It's warm and dry, everything you'd want in a cabin, in my humble opinion. A home away from home." His mom turned around at that. "Why did you leave us?" Miles asked, the relief he'd felt earlier suddenly warping into pain. "We thought you were dead." Mom, tears tinged his eyes, and seeing this, Tim excused himself, stepping outside. Miles' mom, who had been emptying a can of meatloaf into a saucepan, placed everything she was doing aside and leaned against the kitchen counter. She folded her hands above her chest, her smile and the enthusiasm in her eyes fading away. "I had," she said in a low tone as if reminding herself. "I would have died if I stayed, Miles. I needed to get away," she continued. "And you couldn't take us," Miles barked with quivering lips. "We spent months searching." Warning. "Why?" His mom walked toward him, sitting him on one of the dining chairs. "You're a grown man now, and you have no idea how happy I am to see you, but I'll level with you. Your dad and I had a falling out when you were young." She ran a hand along a scar on her arm. "We might have seemed like a happy couple, but we weren't. I would have died if I stayed," she said, but Miles wasn't hearing it. Lizzie whimpered. "You two were happy." "I know, because I was there. I remember it all, Mom. You only remember the things we want you to remember." "A happy childhood." "Happy," Miles scoffed. "Tell that to the therapist I've been seeing for 18 months. Don't use the tone with me, young man," his mom snarled, and he found himself sinking into himself. "Not everything is bright and beautiful, Miles," his mom said. "The real world is full of pain and disappointments. I wanted to protect you from that. I didn't want a son who grew up hating his father or mother." She reached for Miles's hand and said, "Some days I wished I could tell you everything, let you in on what I was planning. I spent weeks thinking about bringing you along, but I couldn't do that to you, not when you had your entire life in front of you." She sat down as well. As I said, you're grown now, so I'll level with. If you want, I can tell you everything.